The 1998 DOJ antitrust case against Microsoft began during the browser wars, when Windows dominated personal computing, and the government started arguing Microsoft wasn't just organically successful, but was using their dominance to remove potential future competitors, which was triggered by the fight between Internet Explorer and Netscape Navigator, where Microsoft connected Explorer into Windows at a level that would just break parts of Windows if removed, and also had legal contracts with companies. So when the DOJ and 20 states sued in 1998, the case argued Microsoft used pressure on its partners to maintain a monopoly. Then the trial itself became famous, especially Bill Gates' deposition, and in the 2000s came the huge news where a judge actually ordered Microsoft to be split into two companies. Microsoft, of course, appealed, the breakup was overturned, and instead the case ended in a settlement with restrictions rather than dismembering the company, which I'm sure is very surprising to you all. But this case, interestingly enough, I think still did some damage because years of legal pressure made Microsoft more cautious and slow at a moment when the internet was exploding, which definitely helped leave openings for companies like Google. The 2004 EU competition case against Microsoft came from two big accusations. First, that Microsoft was withholding technical information rival server companies needed to work properly with Windows networks. And second, the more known one, that bundling Windows Media Player into Windows gave Microsoft an unfair advantage over competitors. And when the European Commission ruled in 2004, it was a huge moment because of course it's the EU, but Microsoft was also both hit with a record fine of nearly 500 million euros and got forced to actually make changes. They had to share the technical information with rivals, and were also ordered to sell a version of Windows without Media Player, which became the Windows N edition that still exists today. Microsoft fought the ruling, but largely lost on appeal, and what made this case even bigger is that regulators kept saying Microsoft wasn't complying properly, which led to even more massive fines over the next several years. This affected the browser wars too, with Europe later forcing a browser choice screen for Windows users, making this case effectively a decade-long one, and a lot of people see this as the moment Europe got more willing to go after big tech much more aggressively, which is why the case still gets relevance anytime the EU targets big companies today. I already briefly mentioned the browser fallout that came with the EU case, but there were a lot of interesting details surrounding it. The earlier 1998 DOJ case failed to implement any meaningful change, so even years later there was still the issue that Microsoft was using Windows' dominance to keep Internet Explorer on top, something the EU didn't really like. At first, Microsoft even proposed shipping a version of Windows without any browser at all, which was called Windows 7e, but that idea was scrapped. Instead, in 2010, millions of European users started seeing the browser ballot, which was the screen that let you pick from browsers like Firefox, Chrome, Opera, or Internet Explorer very easily in Windows. And this wasn't some small software tweak, regulators had literally changed part of the Windows setup. It also came at a time when browsers, especially Google Chrome, were gaining users quickly, so it was seen as a real blow to Internet Explorer's default status. But what made the story even bigger is that in 2011, the browser ballot disappeared from millions of PCs after a Windows update, which Microsoft said was a technical mistake. Regulators did not take that lightly, and in 2013, the EU hit Microsoft with a $561 million fine, which made it into one of the most famous compliance failures in antitrust history. The Vista-capable class action came out of one of the most embarrassing parts of the Windows Vista launch. Before Vista even shipped, Microsoft created the Windows Vista-capable label for PCs, basically telling buyers the machines they were buying would be ready for Vista. The problem was that the stupid consumers thought Vista-capable meant that their computer would be Vista-capable, but a lot of these computers could only run Vista Home Basic, not the fuller Vista experience people thought they were getting, especially with things like the Aero interface Microsoft heavily advertised. The lawsuit started in 2007, but it became a much bigger deal when it turned into a class action, and all the internal Microsoft emails that came out which showed how Vista was actually handled. Some of those emails were brutal, talking about lowering hardware requirements partly to keep more PCs qualifying. And this was all happening while Vista already had a rough reputation for compatibility and performance issues, and Microsoft ended up paying and losing parts of the lawsuit in 2009. The Eolas patent case, I think, is Microsoft's strangest legal case because this one wasn't just about monopoly power or antitrust. It started in 1999 when Eolas, whose job was to commercialize browsers, sued Microsoft over technology responsible for embedding interactive objects inside web pages, so things like plugins, applets, and multimedia. These aren't things most people knew or even know about, but this was foundational web technology, which is why people ended up taking it so seriously. Then in 2003, a jury hit Microsoft with a verdict worth over $500 million, which was enormous for a software patent case. There was genuine concern this could force changes in how browsers handled web content, and that actually did for parts of it. One of the side effects was the old click to activate behavior in Internet Explorer, where users had to click embedded Flash or ActiveX content before using it. A lot of people remember that annoyance and never knew it existed because of this lawsuit. Microsoft eventually settled, but the case got even bigger when Eolas started suing a long list of other companies too. Then years later, courts started declining Eolas those claims and lightened up browser rules, probably for the best. The Get Windows 10 lawsuit came out of a backlash over Microsoft's GWX campaign, short for Get Windows 10. When Windows 10 launched in 2015 as a free upgrade, Microsoft pushed it incredibly aggressively. It started with upgrade reminders and notifications, but over time people felt it crossed into forcing the upgrade. Installation files were showing up on some PCs without people even asking for them, and the moment that really made it infamous was when users accused the upgrade prompt of making the close or the X button effectively schedule the upgrade instead of cancelling it. I believe there were actually a few lawsuits filed, but the most famous case was a California woman named Terry Goldstein, who said her PC upgraded to Windows 10 without approval, caused huge problems for her business, for which she then sued Microsoft and won $10,000, which wasn't a huge amount of money relatively, but this case became quite well known because it went against this giant company aggressive upgrade tactics, and obviously people always like underdog relatable cases, especially one where someone sued over a Windows update and actually won. Microsoft later backed off some of the pushier upgrade behavior, and the whole Get Windows 10 campaign eventually ended. The Slack lawsuit against Microsoft is like a modern version of Microsoft's old browser antitrust battles, because Slack leaned into that comparison on purpose. In 2020, Slack filed an antitrust complaint in Europe arguing Microsoft was unfairly pushing Microsoft Teams by bundling it into Microsoft 365 and Office, meaning millions of businesses were getting Teams by default, whether they chose to or not. Slack's argument here was basically that Microsoft was using Office's dominance to force distribute Teams in a way competitors couldn't realistically keep up with since it's Windows after all. And the timing here is important too because this was during the pandemic, when workplace software, and I guess just software in general, was blowing up. Teams was growing incredibly fast, and Slack thought bundling was helping Microsoft unfairly lock in the market, even though Microsoft had the full right to do so. So for a few years the complaint was going nowhere. But then the EU opened a formal investigation, and once regulators started to agree with Slack, Microsoft began making some concessions, including selling versions of Office without Teams and allowing to port your data over to other competing apps. Windows Recall is a little different from the others because this isn't really a lawsuit story, at least not yet, but I found it too interesting to skip over, and I think it's still relevant to this video. In 2024, Microsoft announced Windows Recall as a flagship AI feature for Copilot Plus PCs. And the idea was that it would take periodic snapshots of almost everything you do on your computer, even private activity like your chats, documents, and browsing history, and make all of it searchable later, almost like giving your PC a memory. If you trust Microsoft completely, this may sound like a cool feature, but obviously most people don't. And even if you do trust Microsoft, it's still incredibly stupid to create a giant archive of extremely sensitive information on your computer, which again could comprise of passwords, financial info, private messages, all just sitting in these searchable screenshots. And what made things so much worse is that when people searched the actual implementation of this feature, they found that the stored data wasn't even properly encrypted, which is like below minimum for any company, but especially Microsoft. This definitely would have ended in a lawsuit quickly, but Microsoft acted quick and pulled back the rollout almost immediately and redesigned Recall to be opt-in, added actual encryption, and put it behind a password, which is insane how they didn't even have that initially. So I guess to the 3 Copilot users watching this video, be a bit more careful with the things that you talk about. I've decided to play around with more interesting ideas instead of just following one format because of course I want more views, but also just to improve how I make these videos, so please let me know what you thought of this video and idea overall. If you enjoyed though, give the video some hype, share it with a friend, and thank you for watching.